Welcome back, everybody. It's Fundraisers Friday on the Nonprofit Show. Welcome, my favorite person in fundraising, Tony Beall.
Hi there, Julia. Happy Friday.
Hey, we have a really big topic to discuss today. We're asking the question, is fundraising now a data job? And I think that this has to do with the human connection, the piece of the pie that human introspection and relationship that fundraisers have. And so it's really something that's changing, and I can't wait to discuss this with you. We get a lot of really interesting questions and comments that come into the nonprofit show, especially around fundraising. And we are supported by our nonprofit partners along this journey. And they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Intuit QuickBooks. Tony, we're coming up on our 1,600th episode in an upcoming episode with you and I on Fundraisers Friday in just a couple weeks.
Wow, how exciting.
I know, pretty cool, huh? Anyway,
Very.
he's Tony Beall, I'm Julia Patrick, and let's get into it because I'm gonna human up. That's my new thing. As opposed to saying man up or woman up, I'm now trying to say human up.
Human up.
I'm gonna human up and admit that I can get really somewhat overwhelmed by this data flush of information. How do we not get overwhelmed?
Well, that's a great question, and this is going to vary for everyone. I think, Julia, we talked in a recent episode about how when we want to do something, how overwhelming it is, because in the spirit of equity, we want to do it for everyone. So
Right.
we'll start this conversation the same way, that you may not have the
Right.
bandwidth to really data dive into every area. So think about the ones that are the most important, the ones that might be most at risk. And then can you data mine all of it, or can you only data mine the top 10%? So let's just kind of frame it like that so everybody can go, right as we start,
Right.
right as we start the conversation.
And I love that you said that. You did say that a couple weeks ago about something completely different, but you gave me permission to kind of like exactly what you just said and did. Take a deep breath and exhale. And if you're looking at the top 10% or maybe the bottom 10%,
Right.
like where are you losing people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then biting that off in chunks, it just seems like it's a lot easier to manage.
Yeah, and data is a big umbrella. So there's so much that falls under data. There's, how is a particular campaign, working or succeeding? Data around an individual donor, data around a sponsor. I mean, data following grants, data around e-blasts and open rates. I mean, there's just so much data for you to absorb that is relevant to being a successful fundraiser. I think, though, the first thing to do, again, is just embrace the term data, because some folks are going to think, well, if I live in a data mindset, then I'm treating my donors like a transaction, and that's not the kind of fundraiser I want to be. So data really is meant to be a tool, something that helps empower you in your work, not something that frames your work.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I love that you said that. I think that's really powerful. And to me, what you just said might help mitigate some of that sense of drudgery when we're like, your CRM is only as good as the information you put in, and that whole push to be interacting, right, with your CRM and this data.
Mm-hmm. And that's probably part of the data too. If you're using a robust CRM, as you're tracking, the moments that you have a phone call with a donor, when you're sending them a letter. I mean, whatever that is, you're tracking the activity along that donor journey for yourself and for the institution.
Right. Well, and I think there are a lot of CRMs now that, and this is nothing new, that will report back to the organization how long you are spending on that platform.
Sure.
right? So, so wherever you are in the spectrum of the C-suite,
Mhm.
somebody's monitoring how much engagement you are using in using that system.
Yeah, and we've always leaned into, as fundraisers, and we've always had to lean into data and understanding data. Again, data is a big umbrella. When I first think of data, I think of numbers, and then I immediately think of budgets. And what is the budget for this fundraising event? And what is going to be the net return on that investment? And so I always, initially when I think of data, I definitely think in terms of numbers. But like I said, it's a big umbrella. There are a lot of items and lanes that fall underneath data.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Okay, so let's flip the switch a little bit and navigate towards that more ephemeral aspect of personality and intuition or gut. All of the words that you want to use. We were joking in the green room about that. Read the room, and I feel like we're getting further and further away from that with next gen leaders. And part of this, bless their hearts. I mean, it's because of COVID. It's because they haven't had that human engagement as much as somebody from my generation or your generation.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering how you advise us to be thinking about this, making decisions based on data, or sometimes you can look at the data and just say, yeah, I don't see that, or I don't believe that, or I'm not going to follow that because of my intuition.
Right. So it is a fine line when we're
Yeah.
when we're talking about this data versus intuition. Data can help guide us to a decision point, but it doesn't make the decision for us. So you and I talked a little bit about in the green room, the numbers may all align and say yes, financially, again, data to numbers, financially, this looks great. But maybe there's something ethically that's not right about the proposal or the partnership or the program. So data isn't necessarily going to guide you down an ethical lane. It will
Right.
guide you to a place to make a decision. And then the ethics around that decision really rests within you as the individual. And that's even more so than intuition. That's just knowing the difference between right and wrong.
Right.
Uh, but even when we're using, I think we're going to talk a little bit about AI. But even in today's AI climate, uh, we still need the human element. If you're using AI, you still need to look at that content, if that's what you're using it for, and make sure it represents your tone. And I still go in and edit a lot of
Mhm.
what AI brings back to me, just so that I can ensure it's really the message that I want to send in a tone that's true to who I am.
Right. So speaking of that, you know, can you give me examples of where this intuition might butt up against data? And I'm thinking more along the lines of throughout your career, and you have being an AFP chapter president, um, folks that look good on paper, the data might come back, the reports are like, holy moly, this person has tremendous capacity. But then you have a sense of like, but yeah, maybe they're not a great fit for our organization, or maybe they have baggage that's going to come back and harm
Mhm.
us another way. Those are hard things to express when you might not have any data sets to support that feeling, that
Mm.
intuition.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I was trying to think of another example of that where the data would, again, if you feel like ethically it's not right, but also we have to, again, data will take us to a place of a decision, and then we have to think of conscious or unconscious biases in our decision making, and data is not going to prevent an individual from making a biased decision. Uh,
Mhm.
let's say in an example where maybe we've put some RFPs out to market, and
Mhm.
we get 3 RFPs back. And now we're looking at the data and comparing the data, the pricing, per unit or whatever it is. But we're comparing the information, the data that we've received from these three entities. And just so it may, I'm stumbling on my words. The data may say choose entity B,
Right.
but maybe entity B, if this isn't part of your rubric, only has 1 star on Google reviews. So, again, the data, the rubric, and just having that other kind of knowledge around what's right for your market, I think is important with your intuition.
Well, and I think another tool should, and we haven't talked about this for a while, but another tool could or should be a gift policy. So, for example, if you are an organization that works in substance abuse, will you take money from a spirits company or a tobacco company? Or, I think there are things like that that sometimes they become more of an intuitive decision, right? I mean, and then you have to kind of back up and say, we have a policy that we don't take funds or we don't engage in businesses that do this.
Right.
I mean, and again, we haven't talked about that for a while, but Tony, I feel like that's a really big issue. I feel like that we are losing sight of that. I don't know if you think that or not, but
yeah, I don't know what the data. I'd be curious to know how many organizations actually have some type of formal gift policy. That would be really interesting information. I'll have to look for that after our show because now I'm very curious.
Yeah, I'm curious too because I feel like you don't, as an organization, you don't go out and look for that until you've had a problem.
Right. Oh no, it should be part of your risk management plan is having
It has to be.
a gift policy.
It has to be. And then you're just like, oh, holy moly. I mean, then that just becomes really brutal. Before we go on, we've had a really cool comment from one of our viewers named Anne. And Anne writes in, data can show us patterns, gaps, opportunities, but it cannot replace listening, judgment, stewardship, or the human work inspiring generosity.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Super cool comment. I mean, I love the way that Anne phrased that.
For sure.
Because that's really what I think the through line of our conversation. And I love that a viewer, would chime in right now.
Yeah.
So thank you, Anne. Hey, when we talk about metrics, you started off by saying there's so many different things that we can be tracking, and that becomes part of how we are overwhelmed. So let's talk about some of the things that we believe are probably, dare I say, the starting points or the most important things. What do you see in this list? We have donor lifetime value, giving frequency, email engagement, event attendance, volunteer history. What are some of the pieces that you think we should focus on when maybe we have to choose?
Well, I really think that data around giving frequency or any data around retention. So I think, really focusing on donor retention is important. So if I had to prioritize data, that's probably where I would go first, is what data do I need to understand donor giving frequency, our current donor patterns, so that I can minimize, or maximize rather retention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think so many of the CRM platforms right now, they actually keep a running track of that. And if you're using a dashboard system where that means it comes up literally on your computer screen, every time you log in, a lot of that information will be tracked and you've got to pay attention to it because the donor retention rates in the nonprofit sector are just dreadful. And I think you and I have talked about this. If you opened up a sandwich shop or a fine dining restaurant, either one, and you had poor retention, you'd be out of business, right? And people aren't coming back to buy your pizza or the, $500 bottles of wine, whatever it may be. You're in crisis, just like the nonprofit sector.
Mm-hmm. And then, so at first I think retention. Then the other thing I think about is marketing and messaging and
Mhm.
looking at the direct data around open rates and click throughs. And I'm not a master at that, but I know just enough to be dangerous to know what are some of the important elements through your communication strategies. So that's probably another one that I would put up towards the top of the list is really just gathering data on communication frequency, what's happening on social, what's happening with direct mail, what's happening when I send something through constant contact, and
Mhm.
really kind of looking at that. And again, there's numbers involved in that, and I'm sure that numbers that can help you determine, am I sending this at the wrong time of day? Maybe I should do a test and send it later in the day, or maybe I need to look at the imaging. Maybe the imaging isn't capturing folks, or whatever that might be. But I think getting data around your marketing success is another one that I would find important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because again, we can fall in love with the work, or we can think, oh my God, this is such a beautiful piece, or this is such a strong message. But if it's not resonating and it's not working, whatever our tendency is to think about the work, we've got to back up and look at what that impact is.
I mean,
Uh,
this is a little bit of a stray, maybe, but everyone, and you can tell because of the similarities in the styling, how many organizations are using AI to create their
yeah,
graphics. I mean,
yeah,
it's obvious,
yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of them are vibrant and beautiful, but if you're the one creating that, and it's real easy to get caught up in, oh my God, this just looks, this looks beautiful, look at the colors, it has everything I wanted to say, and I'm so excited I could do this myself with ChatGPT, and then I throw it out into the market. So having feedback on those, and determining how you can use the AI tool without looking like everything that everybody else is producing. So there was something you said there, Julia, that made me think about that in particular, and the use of.
I agree. I mean, I think that for those of us that operate in this world and we're seeing this, it's so easy to understand or not understand, to recognize what's been generated. And it's like, wow. And pretty soon it just you glaze over and you become judgmental about that and not the message, right? And so
Right.
I agree with you. You have to test it. So let's move through a little bit more on that with this using AI as an interpretation tool, because there are a lot of things that are pretty scary out there that we used to not have easy access to,
Mhm.
and now we do. And this becomes an ethical issue, doesn't it?
It does become an ethical issue. And I think similar to a gift policy you and I were talking about, we wonder how many organizations
Yeah,
have implemented some type of AI usage policy.
right.
Uh, and I know organizations are talking about it, to the extent that I know some organizations won't allow AI note taking for board meetings.
Hmm.
So there are those conversations on whether or not those organizations have stepped into a formal space with a policy. I don't know, but I know that there are conversations about when do you use AI and when do you not, and then so some AI, again, I'm not an expert, but I think some AI is open access, and then some of it is not so open access, so that some of the information that you're using it for, putting into it, is a little more confidential than maybe another version. But again, don't quote me on that. Go to
It,
AI and ask. Go to AI and ask the question. I'm not really sure.
that's right. Well, I think it's really an important issue because, especially in the context of fundraisers, where you might be uploading, really sensitive data. And I'm not just talking about credit cards and, debit cards, but really important things that then
Sure.
can easily go back out into, the marketplace at large if you are, depending on the type of software platform you're using for your AI. And I'm seeing more and more organizations, Tony, that are drawing a line in the sand about which AI products you can use, the organization can use.
Right.
And they're saying, okay, we're going to only use Gemini, or we're going to only use ChatGPT, or because they're buying licenses, they're buying into a system that is a little bit more closed. And I think especially with our platforms that we use, especially the CRMs, even accounting software, HR software, they all have, this agentic platform built
Mm-hmm.
in. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have to understand where that information is going, because it can really imperil your trust factor with your donors. It's a super big thing, and I feel like this is evolving, right? So what we're talking about today, it's going to be different next month, certainly different by the end of the year, and so we have to be invested in this.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And I think one of the most important items listed here really is predictive analytics in terms of just the value of AI and predictive kind of analysis. So I've used AI with a fundraising idea, and I'll put it in there and I'll say, what's the feasibility in this market for this to be successful? Has anything like this ever occurred in this market? The other day, I asked AI to look at a date that I had selected to an event to see what was the risk factor for the date that I had selected. So there's so many different ways that you can use it, again, to help you just be informed and to help you feel more empowered about your decision making.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, as we started off, it's still a judgment issue. It's still the human aspect that you have to be the editor, if you will, of this tool.
for sure.
And I think that that becomes part of the, piece of it. I also think too, there's that old school thing is that, the data can be interpreted a lot of different ways, and depending on how you sell it and what you believe and how you know, market that data, if you will, how you market those points. Like
Oh,
we're gonna all believe that this is the number that we're stuck on and that we're
yeah.
gonna promote. And yeah, we don't talk about that enough, but I think
No, I
that
mean,
that
how you frame it is everything.
yeah, really true. Okay, so then we're gonna end with this question, and this is like a little cerebral and it's a little kind of goofy in some ways, but I think it's a big question, and it is, if your database or your CRM went down tomorrow, do you still know your donors? It's a big question, right?
It is a big question. Uh, the thing that came to mind immediately, Julia, was if your CRM went down and you were in the grocery store, would you still recognize your donor?
Yes.
You,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
but then I break out in a sweat, like given the size of the donor base. Oh my goodness! Like what percentage of them would I be able
Yeah.
to know personally in that way to acknowledge them at the grocery store
Yeah.
uh, or to yeah. So we do we talk a lot about the need for a CRM, but then we do heavily rely upon them for birthday reminders and and all of those other important stewardship points.
Yeah, touch points. I think it's a really interesting thing, and maybe that's one of those soul searching moments, because at the end of the day, we talk about relationships and how we work with our donors. And as we move through to these incredible tools and these CRMs that are just amazing, amazing, that the things that they can do to help us. At the end of the day, to your point, I love the grocery store example. I love that, Tony, because that's reality, man.
Yeah, yeah, but also I think in today's environment, and I say that like you like an old person, but I think in the landscape that we're existing in today, there is a lot more interaction one on one via cell phone. So it's not like folks
Yeah.
are sitting at a desk with some big phone system anymore. Folks are connecting with donors via their personal or maybe business cell phone. So a lot of that information is still captured if your CRM were to go down, depending on how you're interacting with your donors.
Yeah. And I think the point of it is that, you know, how invested are you in the human quotient, right? I mean,
Mhm.
how invested are you in naturally being curious and storing information and behavior that allows you to move forward with somebody without that tool?
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, it kind of goes back to what we were saying. I mean, can you read the room? Can you use, the human experience to move
Mhm.
forward on your fundraising?
Mhm.
Um, and it's kind of an interesting aspect, right? And I also agree with you. The number, based on the number of folks in your individual portfolio, or perhaps if you're a one man band, how do you navigate that? I
Yeah.
like your 10% rule, Tony.
Yeah.
That's
I
really
mean, you gotta start somewhere with that, just for your own sanity. And I will say, I know we're starting to run out of time, but I one of the things I love about this show is how I feel like we can often empower folks or give them permission, perhaps, to do things differently or to think differently. And so I just close out by giving folks kind of the empowerment to advocate for the tools that you need to
Mhm.
do this work. And a lot of times data, capturing data and having access to data requires investments in tools and technology that is well worth it. So I just wanted to say to folks, if data is a critical part of this work. It drives again, it drives us to that point of well-informed decision making.
Mhm.
And so you need the tools that are necessary to provide you with the data that helps drive the great work.
I love it. So that's why you are the co-author of the architecture of fundraising, because that is absolutely an amazing reminder of how we make investments in ourselves, our profession, and ultimately our success, is understanding that we are going to have to go out and make some investments in these CRMs. And sometimes that involves training, that involves, different things. It's not just about, you know, as they say, buying a seat with a software platform. So yeah, thank you for reminding us that that's really super cool. Speaking of the architecture of fundraising, it's still available on Amazon. It's $19.99. It's a great, great tool. And I encourage everyone to take a look at it and then reach back to Tony and I and let us know
Let's
if it
know.
helped you, what you thought, and maybe some of your comments. We've had a great viewer comment run today. And again, I want to thank those who participated and sent in their comments to us and for us around this super important topic. If you have questions that we can help you with, or maybe open them back up to the community, let us know. Reach out to us at info@americannonprofitacademy.com, and it will filter through to us. Tony and I are both very active on LinkedIn. You can reach us that way. And we want to know what you're seeing in your part of the country or world that maybe warrants a conversation or even a show. Again, we have amazing show partners here, and they include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that are with us day in and day out. And as I mentioned to Tony, and I think I brought it up at the beginning of the show, in just a couple weeks, our 1600th episode will be on a Fundraisers Friday episode. So we're very excited about that.
I'm going to get my party hat.
I know, I know. We'll have to do something because we kind of were lackadaisical about it for 1500. So we gotta I gotta sharpen up a little bit. But anyway, hey, as we end each and every episode of the Nonprofit Show, we leave with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well, so you can do well.